Welcome to another episode of The Week in Hand. Today I am delighted to be joined by John Grogan, and I think this is a perfect time to have this gentleman on, as we have such a heightened geopolitical arena at the moment. So we'll just delve straight in, John, if that's okay. How did you first get into politics, and where did this sort of passion for politics come from?
I think probably it came from my parents, who were both teachers. I grew up in Berlin Wharfdale. My dad was a little bit involved in the Labour Party, and he was the sort of teacher. He ended up being a head teacher of a primary school. Who, if anything was going on in the school, if there was a school trip or a school outing, he was absolutely determined he'd find a way of every kid taking part, whether they had any money or not. And that was his sort of informed his politics. He wasn't very active in the Labour Party, but he was quite active. And so I joined in Berlin Wharfdale the Labour Party at 15, and I then got involved at university, and from quite a young age, I was involved in politics during the miners' strike, and in fact stood for the council when I was about 24. So it was in my blood, so to speak. I can remember Harold Wilson winning in the 60s. I was about 4 or 5 then, and my dad and mum being pretty pleased. So it was always a political household, and then I spent a good part of my 20s and 30s fighting Selby, which was some of your listeners will know it. It's sort of big part of rural Yorkshire. So it took me about 15 years to win that seat, coming from 3rd place.
Wow, that's quite a substantial part of your life. Is 15 years to be aiming for a seat. Just going back there, you mentioned that your dad was a school teacher. I was listening to your talk on YouTube about an all-inclusive Britain, and one of the points that you brought up during that talk was regarding schools and regarding faith schools, and how faith schools have to be 50% non-faith, and how there is this segregation within schools. Could you sort of expand on that, and what your thoughts are around education at the moment, and if that's okay?
Sure. And there's some examples close to home, really, in Keighley, particularly at primary school level. I mean, I think in the Bradford area, the Airedale area, Keighley area, faith schools sometimes are the only schools that bring people of different backgrounds together in the middle of Keighley, for example. So, for example, there's one Catholic primary school in the middle of Keighley, which is about 40% white, 50% Asian, and 10% Slovak. And I was talking to the head teacher there. Does it work? You're a Catholic school. Does it work? And he said that he occasionally gets complaints. And it was about Christmas when I went in, and he said one Asian parent came to the nativity play, and she said she liked the school, but she had one complaint, and she was a grandma, so her kids and her grandkids had gone there, and she said she'd looking back over 25 years, and she said that Jesus had not been played by an Asian kid quite enough. It was 10 times rather than it should have been 11 times or something. And so you think, and so that school was at a primary level was bringing kids together from different backgrounds. And as my brother's a Catholic priest, actually, and so we discuss these things. I think it's part of the role of a faith school, particularly in a mixed area, to try and encourage that form of integration. Because quite frankly, often at secondary school level, and that's certainly true in Keighley, in some schools, that's much harder. And so, I mean, I think there's so much we could do in better in education. I mean, I think one good thing that coalition government got right, incidentally, was giving more money to the pupil premium to schools in poorer areas, and we're going to need that. Coming out of lockdown, the kids who've suffered most are the kids who don't have an internet connection, or whose parents have not got the time or the inclination to do homeschooling and things. So for a lot of kids, they've missed nearly half a year of schooling, and so there's going to be a lot of need to, particularly those kids from poorer backgrounds, to give them extra resources. And there's a lot of people talking about, even if the virus, if we get a little bit better the situation, providing extra help during these coming summer holidays to try and get people back up to speed.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that. Obviously, to do with the virus, and obviously there's a big debate within the media and the political forum at the moment regarding sending children back to school too early or too late. And a lot of the pro argument for sending children back is because of the most vulnerable, and obviously due to sort of domestic harm and things like this. And some reports have come out saying that the virus is hitting ethnic minorities harder. But also workers without university degrees usually have more low insecurity jobs. So therefore, when the recession hits, these groups and sects of people will be hit harder as well. So saying that, how do you think? Obviously, they've got this massive social divide within the country. And what sort of things do you think contributed to this? And how do you think we sort of work our way out of this situation?
Well, I think there's going to be a need for much more now from the government, really. I think the Chancellor, to be fair, got quite a lot right in terms of the support packages, the furlough scheme, and the loans that have been available to business. That's kept some people ticking over. Otherwise it's unimaginable, really, and it's avoided some of the massive increases in employment that have happened in the States. But I think that's coming now. Once that ends, unless it's replaced. I mean, I feel particularly sad for young people, whether skilled or unskilled, whether coming out of school or college or university. I think you've got to do, like, to some extent was done in 2008, 2009. You've basically got to try and guarantee people jobs. You've got to fund those jobs from government, and you've got to be prepared to pay the cost back over many years. And I think coming out of the virus situation as well, we're obviously, hopefully, as a community, going to value jobs that perhaps we're not valued enough. I think of social care in particular. You should have a proper career structure in that in social care now. You should have better wages, and I think people at the top with broader shoulders, higher incomes, are going to have to make one or two sacrifices, really, to provide resources to have a more equal and a more egalitarian society, really. So it's a moment that the country needs to seize, because it's a moment that will go, really. I mean, hopefully, we will be able to get back to a more normal existence, but there's just going to be a moment in the next 6 months when perhaps people want to do things differently, and we certainly can't have lots of young people with nothing to do and no hope and no prospects. We've got there's so much that can be done. People talk of a Green New Deal, and there's so much as a society that we can use the public sector to incentivize the private sector and so on to try and restart the economy. We're going to need to do that.
Yeah, so you mentioned there the social care aspect, and I know this was in your all-inclusive Britain talk as well. So the social care aspect, is mainly as I'm a paramedic in Bradford at the moment,
Yes.
so I have quite a lot of input with or dealings with social care, and what I can sort of devise is that we've gone to more of a privatized social care model, and this obviously then the governance behind that changes due to it being a private sector, predominantly private sector, and people like Alison Pollock in Newcastle have been sort of trying to wave the flag to make the social care sector back into a public forum and a public sector, so therefore it can be managed and governed publicly, and not obviously driven by profit and profit margins. I don't know how that's going to be implemented with such a big private sector. But do you think that is something that could be expanded on? And obviously, social care workers being on sort of minimum wage. And the things they have to do for that minimum wage is 15 minutes of appointments and driving about to and from jobs. I mean, these people are literally the backbone of society, yet we don't treat them that way. It's very, very, very strange how societies become like this, knowing that any one of us could become dependent on these people. I struggle finding where the divide is, but obviously it's usually governed by money.
So I think two questions there, really. I'll do the money one first, and then how do you organise it? The money one first. I mean, if we're going to pay people in social care properly, if we're going to make sure there's enough resources to look after people who are in social care, it's not just the elderly. It can be younger people as well, with some people with severe disabilities and so on and things. So it can be a range of people, but you've got to put a lot more money in there. You can't scrimp and save. So how do you do that? Now, one suggestion that I'm sympathetic with is some of us are lucky enough to own our own homes. Now, we don't know, there might be, shall we say, there's 100 people, there might be 1,000 people listening to this, but let's say there's 100 people listening at the moment. And of those 100, probably 15 maybe are going to need some sort of social care in the future, maybe at the end of their lives and so on. But we don't know which one of us are in that 15 or not. And at the moment, obviously, lots of people end up having to, or their dependents end up having to sell all their assets and so on, and people can't pass anything on to their heirs or to their favourite charity or whatever. So what you could do is you could pool the risk, if you like, and you could put up inheritance tax, widen it slightly, so that probably everybody above a certain level will be paying maybe 15% of their estate, at the end of their lives, and so they'd be able to pass on most of it, but they would be everyone would have to pay in something, and for that you'd get free social care, and you'd make sure that people were paid properly and so on. Andy Burnham suggested this. He's now the Mayor of Manchester. He was the Health Secretary in the Gordon Brown government. And it was called a death tax and things, and it didn't go very far. But you've got to provide those resources somehow. And I don't think you can make the burden on the young, particularly as at the moment. I think for the first time in my lifetime, and probably my parents' lifetime, the young are not really doing better than their parents did, and they've probably got less opportunities than their parents had. And so I don't think you can put this on the young. So that would be one suggestion anyway for how you pay for it. But however you pay for it, there are other ways of doing it as well. You've got to face up to that. And then how do you organise it? I agree that it's changed in the last 40 years from predominantly local council to now predominantly big, there's 3 or 4 big companies who actually often are saddled with debt, and it's not really a very stable model. So I would like to see a revival of local authorities and not-for-profits as well. I wouldn't just have one provider. I think it's good to have some different providers in the area, smaller providers, not-for-profits, councils, public sector, and so on. And you've got to regulate properly because, let's not forget there were and have been scandals in local authority homes as well as in private sector homes of people not being looked after properly. So you've got to have proper and tough regulation. But yeah, I think we've got to change both the way we organise it and the way we fund it.
Yeah, I totally agree with all them points, to be honest, John. I think it's a sector of society that people don't really concentrate on until they need it. And then once it comes around, it's like, I only get a 15-minute visit to put me to bed, and it has to be at 8 o'clock. It's that, it's all these little tiny problems that you don't really appreciate until you having to see them and deal with them, personally. Just moving on ever so slightly, because obviously the area that you former MP in and the area that we live in has quite a big divide, and I've seen this divide grow just by taking more note of what's going on in the public forum. And obviously we were at Ilkley and Keighley, and you mentioned talks around Brexit and how them areas voted differently, even though they're so close together geographically. But when you sort of expand that out, you see the population has become sort of a tribal left and right divide. And I feel like this is sort of making the country spin its wheels and argue with each other rather than progress. Could you sort of expand on how you think these sort of this polarization has happened, and what are the driving factors behind this?
Yeah, well, I think looking at it slightly more optimistically, and you're right, there is massive divides about how people view life, about how people view Brexit and so on and things. But let's be thankful that we live in a country where these massive divides are resolved democratically. And, it's easy to take that for granted. We've had quite a lot of elections, referendum in Scotland, referendum in Europe, all the arguments we had last year. And I regretted the fact that we left the EU. I was on the losing side there, really. But at least when you look around the world, what's happening in Hong Kong at the moment, in Ukraine with Russia invading and so on and things, in Kashmir, which many Asian constituents in Keighley used to write me about. At least we're in a situation where people are still talking to each other. I took some abuse, and it was ever thus as an MP. Part of the job is to take some stick. But I don't think there was ever a time when I couldn't speak to my political opponents, cordially and civilly. And so I think that's something to cling on to as we go forward. I hope that our politics now, after the virus and so on, that there is a chance to come together more as a nation. I would obviously like to see a Labour government myself, and I think that it's a long way back, but I think that is a prospect. I think Keir Starmer's made a decent enough start, and also I think in the early stages of the pandemic there was a big emphasis in the nation that they didn't want party political ding dong as it usually is. I think probably we're getting to the stage now where the arguments are getting a little bit more strident, and I think it's worth. I don't think our record stands up all that well, to be honest. About how we've dealt with the pandemic, but that argument will be had in the coming months. But yeah, we are divided economically, in terms of income levels and so on, about how people view the world. But I think we've got to hang on to the connections that keep us together, and that was always my attitude as Keighley's MP. Try and find things that bring people together. Often it was sport, by the way. I think that's a good one at bringing people together.
Yeah, I was going to move on to sport, but they just stay on this subject just a little bit. obviously with the Brexit vote, we saw the country divided as such, in a way. Could you just give me sort of your reasons for wanting to stay within the EU, and how you saw that being the more positive option, and why that?
Yeah. Well, I just look at the things big challenges that are facing the world, whether it's the environment, whether it's the economy and living standards, and you look at the rise of China now, which is going to probably dominate certainly the rest of my life geopolitically. I always thought that combining with democratic nations in Europe, we were always going to be stronger and have more influence in the world. And now I hope, incidentally, that obviously the decision has been made now, but I hope the deal that we make, which has slightly gone off the news, but it's got to be done by the end of the year, so the Prime Minister says. I can't see why. The sticking point seems to be, the government won't have similar environmental standards and labour rights as in the rest of Europe. We're objecting to that. I don't see why we can't agree to that, even though we're outside Europe, because that's surely in our interest, that we don't want to be competing as a nation by reducing those standards. Surely not. And so I hope that we can do a deal that even now keeps us closer to the EU, that allows, for example,
Sorry, John. Sorry, just to stop you there. Yeah, that's it. You might just.
Sorry.
Carry on.
Sorry. Should I carry on? Or
yeah, carry on. Sorry. Yeah, carry on.
Yeah. So I hope, and for certainly for this generation, I think the decision has been made. But I now passionately hope that as a country we don't just sink in on ourselves, and we've really got to still have good relations, I think, with our neighbours in Europe, like, for example, Norway does, which is outside the EU, and but still has good relations with the European Union. And that's what I'd like to see now, rather than a distant relationship and harking back to times gone past.
Yeah, so obviously the divide within the thoughts around Brexit, at the time that the first referendum came around to vote, me personally, just being completely honest with you, I didn't know what I was looking at or what I was voting for. I was being sold things by the media, and it was who to believe, what to believe. I'm no expert on the single market. I don't own a business. It was very confusing to the layperson.
Yeah.
And then, from my perspective, and correct me if I'm wrong, the general election came round, and it seemed as though Brexit was the turning point, or the arguing point for how that election went. I know the media had a massive influence on this, but still, at that point, I was still like, well, we've got a second chance here to maybe have a second vote if Labour get in, and now we can see the picture clearer. It doesn't look like it's going to be economically better to come out of Europe. Now we all know this. Yet the general population didn't seem to have the same opinion. And this is something that's sort of been bothering me, and this is mainly why I wanted to speak to you. How much influence do you think the media are having on people's thoughts and their thought processes, and how much do you think the average the layperson as such understands what it means to actually come out of Brexit and come out of Europe? Sorry, and do you think they're just voting solely on their biases as such, as their inherent biases?
Well, I think as a politician, you've always got to respect the views of the electorate, and it's easy to blame the media or say people didn't understand it or whatever. But I think they did. I think people did think about it. It was 50-50 really. It was, we were divided. Looking at the polls just before Christmas, it was really close whether people wanted another say, which I thought would have been a good idea. Like, when a trade union does a deal with on behalf of its members, it often puts it back to the members to decide whether they definitely want to go ahead. And I thought that would have been a good idea. but it wasn't the only issue in the election. I think that's possibly the answer to your question. That as a party, we didn't convince people that we were in a position to govern the nation. And, the media has never been particularly favourable to the Labour Party, ever since the 1920s.
Why is that? Why is that, John? Is there some could you give me a little bit background on why?
Well, obviously, quite a lot of the media, but not all the media, is owned by rich people. And you have a socio-economic interest in more right of centre politics. But we have in this country, and again, it's become fashionable on both left and right in recent years to attack the mainstream media and, say it's all Lorna Koonsberg's fault on the BBC. But I've always resisted that myself. I mean, there is a critique there, and, a journalist come from a certain background, and you've always got to try and widen that and so on and things. But I do think we're quite lucky. We'd miss it in this country if we didn't have public service broadcasting and an attempt at impartiality. And that's why actually when in an election period, that's particularly important. And I think that's particularly important to the Labour Party in 2017, that you had that access to the mainstream media. So, there was a whole range of factors that made Labour lose the last general election, and Europe was only one of them. And we didn't really come out with a coherent message in December that matched "Get Brexit Done." We just didn't. We didn't have three words about what we were about.
The slogan politics of the Conservatives seem to be very powerful at the moment.
It is. But slogans are not new in politics, and you've got to have. It wasn't the best organised campaign, to be honest, from where I was viewing it. And right. So it was close. It was ever so close, and we could have gone differently. And sometimes last year it looked as it did, but it didn't. And as a Democrat, you've got to accept that now, and you've got to think, how do we go forward? And for me, the big argument now is, surely to goodness, with all the economic mess the country's in, this idea of divorcing ourselves from Europe, and single market is basically that we can trade particularly goods with Europe without tariffs, and if we don't do a deal, there's going to be tariffs on goods. So they're going to be, food's going to become more expensive. Nissan's going to close in Sunderland, and all for the sake of not agreeing with our European nations that we're just going to have the same labour standards and the same environmental standards. Why wouldn't we do that? Because otherwise we're saying, well, we're going to undercut you by paying our workers less and being more polluting. I mean, it seems to me ridiculous.
That answer there, John, regarding the media surprised me, because obviously from my point of view, they were basically slanderous towards Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, and fake news was prevalent, and from my point of view, it was an all-out attack on the Labour Party, and wasn't a critically fair, equal view of what was going on. So to hear you say, we need these people, and I totally agree with what you're saying. It's a part of our culture is the media, and I just think it's just gone totally unfair, and it's swaying people's opinion one way or the other. The other thing that I would just want to link that to is the recent episode with Dominic Cummings, and how, from my opinion, it very much looked like what the media was doing to him in particular. It was very similar to what they were doing to the Labour Party during the general election. It was a very biased and sort of attacking way of publishing the information, which I couldn't agree with, and found myself even though I'm a you know, ardent Labour supporter and I voted for yourself in the last general election, I found myself wanting to defend Dominic Cummings
Right.
for what he was doing and for what he did. And then that made me look into sort of who he was and what he was about, and you know, what's gone on within the Conservative Party during the Brexit deal and that. And I found myself being even more and more confused about how this particular man and this particular vision that he seems to have won't take any sort of note off any of the expert economists or anything like that, and has this vision of decentralization as such. What are your views on Dominic Cummings, and do you have any views on what I've just said?
Yeah, well, you're a nice fella. Having sympathy with Dominic, and I mean, I can see what you're saying in a way, that it's that you know, when the media pack is pursuing anyone for you know, in neither he nor Jeremy Corbyn committed murder or anything like that. You know, they had opinions, and in Dominic Cummings' case, you know, in Jeremy, their behaviour is open to democratic criticism, but it's never nice to see that media scrum and someone being vilified. So on that level, I can see what you're saying. On the other hand, you know, you need a free democratic press to bring these issues. You know, many people saw it as an issue of hypocrisy and you know, of someone very powerful suggesting rules that they weren't accepting themselves. And you know, it was the Guardian and the Daily Mirror, which is back to my previous point. In a democratic society, you do need is a robust business, you know, standing for election or being in public office or being essentially, as Dominic Cummings is, more powerful than most cabinet ministers, because so long as he has the trust of the Prime Minister, he is a very, very powerful man indeed, and you know, he's directing the government in many ways as effectively the chief of staff of the Prime Minister. So he should be under scrutiny. I push back a little bit what you said. It was a matter of considerable public interest. I actually thought he came across quite well in his press conference, that he wasn't a completely Svengali figure or like off the thick of it or whatever that I mean, I think his particular explanation for his trip out on his wife's birthday to test his eyesight did stretch credulity, to be honest. And I do think it was a distraction for a very important week in our politics, and it did cost the government quite a bit in confidence and so on and things. And I think he's worthy of public scrutiny, because you know, people ask, would it have been any different under Jeremy Corbyn or Keir Starmer or indeed Theresa May?
That was going to actually be my next question. Yeah.
Well, my answer to that is, you know, obviously you can't rewrite history, but I find it hard to believe that either Keir Starmer or, to be honest, Theresa May, to give her credit, would have missed 5 meetings of the most important committee in government, which is called COBRA, you know, which looks after threats of national security. That in the middle of February, when this was becoming a huge issue, for 5 meetings in a row, there'd be no Prime Minister, that he'd be out at the Dorneywood, which is one of the government estates, just enjoying the half term. And so I think the particular characteristics of the Prime Minister, if you like, and the government he runs meant that we did take our eye off the ball massively. And one of the little things I do in life now is from my kitchen table here, I run a little chamber of commerce with Mongolia.
Yes.
Country, democratic country, I hasten to add, between China and Russia. And so I was out there at the end of January, and they were locking up then. You know, they were closing the schools then and banning public gatherings. And when I left, which was on January the 28th, I think, masks, I didn't have a mask and I was frowned upon at the airport. And they haven't had one death, incidentally. And it's obviously a small, poor country, really. And so I think we definitely could have done it better, and lives would have been saved, and the temperament of the Prime Minister, as I think will come out in future inquiries, was really not suited to dealing with this crisis. And so I think, yeah, it would have been different had Theresa May been Prime Minister, and it would have been different had Jeremy Corbyn or Keir Starmer have been Prime Minister, just because they would have paid more personal attention to the issue.
I mean, obviously, again, I totally agree with what you're saying there. It does seem like the eye was took off the ball in some respects. I've been wrestling with that same concept myself, and obviously you're much more informed, and that is one of the reasons that I wanted to speak to you, because what it appears to me is that we had this austerity measures which drove sort of the health of the population down, especially the lower end of the spectrum, and that's what we're seeing now when the reports are coming out about them being the hardest hit. And it is multifactorial on why the UK has done so badly in terms of mortality and all-cause mortality rates, but we were never sort of world leaders in health as such, which I think the general population seem to think we are. It's almost like the British football team analogy is the best. We always go to the World Cup thinking we're just going to win it and walk through, and then all of a sudden we're like, oh, other countries are really good too. Like it's a xenophobic view of the world, I suppose the population has. But more to the point is that what I'm seeing is this blame game on, the current government not handling things well enough, and then them not being able to admit their failures as such, or their even if it's not a failure, even if it's just a mistake in judgment because the ball was rolling too fast with the pandemic and the crisis and the statistics and the things involved, all the different things involved were too difficult to handle for a newly elected government and leader to really get a grasp of. So I've sort of have been a little bit sympathetic towards them, but I'm seeing a lot of blame, but pointing the finger and blame, and not a lot of okay, you're right, let's learn from that, let's us be critical, and let's, even to the point where they're not willing really to release the SAGE meetings to understand what the scientific advice was and whether or not the government have listened to that, or whether they've listened to popular opinion. And that to me is like, well, at least put the information out in the public for the public to decide. When you're hiding it, it automatically looks like you've done something wrong. It's so, to me. But now we have to trust this government in leading us out of this and through a recession. So could you maybe just play the devil's advocate and say what the Conservative government can do well and can do for us, try and find some middle ground with obviously the listeners, and there is this massive divide.
Sure, no, I think you make a very good point, which would be good advice, which I would endorse to the government. If you look at what other countries have done, both President Macron, particularly in France, and also Chancellor Merkel in Germany, have adopted a slightly different tone, a slightly less defensive tone. Have said, well, we've got some things wrong, and every government around the world. It is hard. I mean, I acknowledge that it must be so incredibly hard, and they must all be completely exhausted now. I think, obviously, the Prime Minister himself has had the illness, has had many of his closest advisors, and in that sort of rabbit warren, which is what 10 Downing Street is, it must be difficult to make the right calls. But I think what served Dominic Cummings and the Prime Minister well in previously as the Mayor of London, and then in the referendum campaign, where they basically didn't, the basic thesis was you never apologise for everything, you never admit error, you never admit mistakes, and so on. I think that's the wrong thing now, and the government, has got some things right. I particularly mentioned the Chancellor, who represents a Yorkshire constituency, and I think that's widely acknowledged that that's been at least as good as most other countries in Europe, and so they've got some things they can build on. But I do think this idea of, we're not making any mistakes. We'll give you the figures when we want to. It's unclear at the moment, how many of the testing and tracing is happening each day, and it just begins once you start losing that trust. It's very, very hard to regain, and I think there is still quite a lot of goodwill out there in the nation to them. We all obviously want to get it right. We're all hoping and praying that we're not going to see a second wave, but just a change of tone, I think would be good, and not to be afraid to admit error and so on. And just commenting on one other thing you said, the health inequalities, as you say, are not just of the last few weeks and months. They go back ages. And if you mentioned Ilkley earlier on, I think if you go from Ilkley to Bradford, which is about 11 or 12 miles, life expectancy, the average life expectancy declines by about a year for every mile you go. Yeah. And that's just in our area. And you're also right. Some people call it, I'm not sure it's British exceptionalism, but it's sort of English exceptionalism, I think. This idea that, which I think the good government is slightly prone to a little bit, that, it will be all right here because we're English and so on and things. And I think going forward as post-Brexit and so on, I think we've got to be a little bit humbler, and there's a lot to be proud of from in our English history and heritage, and particularly I'd say our Yorkshire history and heritage. But we're all human beings, and we should never forget that.
Yeah, and this is why I love listening to you speak, John, because you're so all inclusive. It's we're in it together, and I think obviously there's been the debate about the virus is non-discriminatory, and
yes.
And we're finding now that the austerity measures and the things that have been in place within government have had a massive effect on how we respond and our utilities and how we deal with the rest of the world. And these things are being put under a microscope, and I think people like myself, who initially wasn't actually that bothered about politics growing up, but now all of a sudden it's like it's in the forefront of what's going on with my life. It's now affecting me. Now it's time to get sort of not militarized, but get informed as such. I think that's that you speak very openly about everybody being inclusive and how we work together, and the things that we have in common are stronger than the things that divide us. And to me it really resonates, and I do think I do thank you for that, and appreciate your honesty when it comes to the answers. Just moving on, you're obviously involved in other countries, and have had a varied career with dealing with other countries, and I know you're really invested in sport. Could you tell me how the rest of your career as such you predict it's going to play out, or what you've got set for the future, and what plans and hopes and aspirations you have for the UK and the UK government going forward?
Yeah, well, so I'm 59, and I since I lost Keith, actually, the first thing I did in January and February is the Labour Party had to have a discussion about how we'd go forward, really, and elect a new leadership team. And so within a couple of days of losing, actually, my good friend Judith Cummings rang me up. She's the MP for Bradford South. And she said she was backing Keir Starmer at the time, and said, would you help organise Yorkshire for Keir Starmer's leadership campaign? So I thought about it for a couple of hours, and then I said yes. And so up until lockdown, that's what I was doing, really, trying to get individual Labour parties to back him in Yorkshire and the Humber, because I thought he would be a credible figure to put forward as Prime Minister in 2024. Now he wears well, but he's only 18 months younger than me. So if he's got a future, I think maybe I have, I don't know. And so I'm involved in various things, as you say. I'm doing some work with other countries, developing nations, who incidentally, particularly democracies, I think, I only work with democracies, and they do, in a quite humbling way, it's always great to show people from Mongolia or other countries around Westminster, because they around Parliament, because they do, you know, see it as something to aspire to, and we might find that strange, but they do want something akin to the democracy that we have. So I'll do some of that. In Yorkshire, I'm a big believer in what's called devolution for Yorkshire. More power, more decisions being made in Yorkshire. I won't bore you with all the details of it, but you know, we've got 5 million people in Yorkshire, same roughly as Scotland, and yet in Scotland they have far more powers. Now, I'm not saying that we should have necessarily a Prime Minister of Yorkshire, but I think the next Labour government, I'd like to see bring in an assembly, at least for Yorkshire, with more powers over the economy, over things like skills and training and so on, and transport here in Yorkshire. So I'm working with the leaders of councils from across Yorkshire, both Labour and Tories. They've asked me to help them with that. So that's another thing I'll keep doing. And so I would like to see a Labour government in 2023, 2024. It's a long way off, but that's what I'll be working towards. And it's a huge task because we're now not got many more than 200 seats, and we're looking for a sort of swing that the last big swing to Labour was 1997 under Tony Blair. Even if we got the same sort of swing, it would, I think, give us a very, very small majority. And it depends a lot what happens in Scotland as well. So it's going to be tough, but I'd like to spend the next few years helping to develop our policies, which we'll put to the country in 2024. And I could go into lots of detail, but since you mentioned sport, let's have a couple of minutes on sport. I mean, I'm passionate about sport in bringing people together and inspiring people. And one thing I've always worked on in Parliament actually is this, and it just shows you what a difference politics can make to sometimes some of the smallest things in our society. Really, there's a list in our law of events that have to be on free-to-air TV. Things like it's not an accident the Football World Cup is available, and you mentioned football yourself, to everyone, or that the Olympic Games is available to everyone. It's available to everyone because there's a law that says it has to be made available to free-to-air TV at a reasonable price. And as a big cricket fan, you know, one of my regrets is that over the last well, it's 15 years now, there's been no live cricket on free-to-air TV. And I can remember once going into a school in Keighley and showing them two pictures. One was of Joe Root, you know, the England captain and Yorkshire player and so on. Another one was a worldwide wrestler whose name I forget, from the United States. And all the kids, and this is a mixed school, so it was Asian, white, they all knew the worldwide wrestler. Two of them knew Joe Root. And I'm glad to see there is actually a little bit of cricket coming back onto the BBC in the coming weeks. But just that level, you know, sport shouldn't just be for the kids of people who can afford subscription TV. And it's not the most important issue in the world, but it's the sort of thing where Parliament can make a difference.
Yeah, of course. You forget. You almost forget your own privilege when you've got access to the internet and TV. You're able to view, you know, the sporting events that you want to view because you're able to afford to view them.
Yes.
And, obviously, at the moment, you know, sporting events have been sort of put on hold, and we've seen this massive sort of, well, what do we do? What do we do with our time now? You know, it's we're going to have to talk to each other, I suppose. But yeah, I appreciate with what you're trying to do there, and I understand the momentous task of what you've got to do before 2024 with Starmer. Do you think he is the man to do it, and do you think the public can get behind him? And how much of because obviously we know now, due to big data and data farming and things like that, the Conservatives seem to have a monopoly on how they advertised and influenced social media as such to win certain votes, quote unquote. So how much technocrat and technology do you think the Labour government need to invest in and go down to actually get this swing to happen?
Yeah, you're right about the importance of social media, and it was interesting in the last election. Facebook, not one of Labour's ads was found to be stretching the truth or whatever, but quite a high percentage of the Conservative ads by independent assessors were in that description. And I do think our electoral law going forward, it's very tight in terms of leaflets, and the expenditure level in Keighley was about 15 grand actually. So you had to do, which is a lot of money, but once you're publishing leaflets and sending letters and manning phone lines and things, that goes. So there's quite tight control over that, but very little control over social media. So yeah, we've got to be very savvy with social media going forward. Can Keir Starmer do it? I think he can. It's a long, hard slog being in opposition. People are only just beginning to notice him now. He's only beginning to introduce himself to the British people. I think he's been quite impressive at question time. I think he will be good at managing a team. I think it was quite a fluent process bringing in his new team and some new faces there, which will people will get to know over the time. He's run a big organisation in the past. And I do think, given the scale of the task, he'd be quite good at unifying us, hopefully, because, shall we say, there is a Labour government again in 2024. It's going to be a very small majority, if a majority at all. And it's not going to be, when I was an MP first, I forget how big the majority was, but it's 100 plus, wasn't it, in 1997? And, there was scope for rebellions and all sorts of things, but and indeed a need for them, really, to challenge power. But this is a very different scenario, and I think he'd be good at that as well. So it's a massive, massive task. But I think I think there's a chance, and by then the country will have had 14 years rather, of Conservative rule, and so really the time for a change argument will, I think, be quite powerful as well.
Yeah, almost enough time maybe to wake up
Yes.
to the actual
Yes.
outcomes, because it's okay. Yes. The promises are okay. And my friend James, we have very heated debates on this. He's very outcome orientated. And he's saying, look, all you have to do is look at the outcomes. It doesn't matter who's there in power. Look at what we're getting, and yes. That's the best example of whether they're doing okay or not. So thank you for your time. I won't hold you up any longer, and hopefully we'll get to do this in the future again, once we're more updated on what's going on post Brexit and with the Labour going for the next general election. Thank you so much, John. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.